Hello, welcome. My name is Ying Lee. I am the community programming producer here at the Playwrights Realm. My pronouns are she, her. We have an exciting panel for you today. And before we get started, I would like to go over some information on logistics. The Playwrights Realm is a value-based organization, and we center in our practice the values of being an equitable, inclusive, anti-racist, and anti-oppressive company. These values also extend to our virtual stage. If at any time you feel you experience something not aligned with those values, please feel free to chat me directly or to email us. I'm putting some more information about our mission and values in the link below in our chat. Connected to these values, we also recognize the additional barriers that caretakers experience. So if you incur any caregiving costs while attending this webinar, we'd be happy to reimburse you. This is through our Radical Parent Inclusion Project. In the follow-up email you'll receive tomorrow, I'll send you a link to the reimbursement form, and I'll put more information about the program in the chat. I also want to acknowledge that we are joining you today from the traditional unceded territories of the Lenape. Colonization is an ongoing process that continues to impact the lives and lands of Native communities. In addition to the physical lands that we occupy today, the platforms, technology, and equipment that we are using consume resources that are based in physical land and are not universally accessible to all peoples and communities. If you would like to learn more about the land that we occupy, I'm putting a link in the chat. We're about to dive into the panel. And before we do, a few logistics. The Q&A feature is open for this panel. Please feel free to use it to ask any questions of our panelists. It's the little button that's at the bottom of your screen. And at the end of the panel, we'll choose some to answer. Zoom now offers captions. Please feel free to turn those on if you would like. And I'm also putting in the chat a link to the event program. This has information about our panelists and their bios. Great. And I'm super excited to welcome you today to this virtual stage, our lead panelist for today, Corey Atkins.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thank you very much, Ying, for those acknowledgements and recognition and information. And I am so thrilled to recognize these tremendous panelists that the Realm has assembled today. Just by way of introduction, in the order that's on my screen, I'd like to welcome Brandon Webster. Hello, Brandon. And Naysan Mojgani. And Angie Morgan. Hello, welcome. Thank you all so much for joining me. I'm excited to talk about a shared experience that we all had over the past few months and kind of the roots of this conversation really, which is the Playwrights Realm's script share program. And if, oh, we've got a cat already. That's one. Anyone who's playing Zoom bingo, there's one right there. So over the script share program, and actually I'm just going to read you what the Playwrights Realm has on their website about this program, because I think it's a good entree to this conversation about what it means to receive feedback and what it means to give feedback. So the script share program is an opportunity for aspiring writers to engage in a 1-hour discussion with a theater professional about a particular script. The conversations are driven by what the writer is hoping to explore, and aim to provide an initial response, perspective guidance around craft of playwriting, and further questions rather than critical feedback. So I think that's sort of an interesting springboard for our conversation, and maybe a place to start is talking about what it means to give feedback. I think anyone who writes is probably going to give feedback to other writers. All artists are hopefully a part of that sort of collaborative exchange of ideas. So I'd like to just ask first off, in your experience with script share, as you went into talking with these writers from literally all around the globe, I spoke with someone in London, I spoke with someone in New Zealand, you know, what is sort of one sort of top line that you took away from that experience that you might give as advice or best practices to someone giving feedback, especially in a situation where all you really know about that person is what you've read on the page? And I'll let anyone start who'd like to.
I'll dive in. I mean, I think that, so I'm Naysan. I think that the biggest thing in any context of giving feedback, and really any sort of artistic practice is always about, it's a conversation, right? So listen and respond in the same way that, you know, right, our feedback is based on reading those words on the page, and we're simply responding to that, sharing our experience of that, in the same way that the feedback process is just continuing that conversation that very much started with reading the first page of the script.
I think I found, oh, I am so sorry, by all means, go.
No, I was just saying, yes, I agree. Please go for it, Brendan.
I think I found that actually probably the most important thing up front with writers is to really put effort into building rapport, and not doing that artificially, but actually asking what their process is. How do you sit down and begin to write? Is this all essentially like hours and hours of free writing that we're looking at? Were there outlines? Getting to know how your writer writes, how your writer thinks about the world around them really, really, really does help give context to how you give notes. I think especially during script share, I make notes early on and then review and double check and like, how would somebody take all this note, all that great stuff. But I think even in building rapport with writers, I found that some notes that I was prepared to give, it's like, actually, this note isn't appropriate right now. We don't need to think about this. I don't even want to put that on your plate. Just let's talk about these things. And I think it's way easier to contextualize the piece when you've done the effort to really understand the writer in front of you.
If I can jump in and just build on what Naysan and Brendan are saying, I think one of the things that script share really sort of reminded me of in terms of that relationship building and the conversation that we're having with writers is the importance of language and how like literally the words we use when we give feedback. And if through building a rapport with a writer, I learned that this is the very first play they've ever written, right? Maybe they started in a different form of writing. I'm going to have to remind myself to strip away some of the jargon I might use with a writer who's written umpteen plays and sort of has spent a life in the American theater specifically. And that can't happen without that relationship, without starting a conversation and really getting to know sort of who the writer is and where the play is coming from. So that was a really exciting thing about script share, was getting to meet writers who were coming at their plays from very different backgrounds.
Yeah,
go ahead. I just want to add one more thing, that I think that along those similar lines, that it's, especially in the context of script share, but I think that an important part of the process in general for feedback, right, that you know, there's so many hats that dramaturgs wear, and when I'm talking and thinking about what all of those roles are, one of the ones that is almost always on the list is a cheerleader. And so I think that there's part of that in this context, particularly for those writers who are very early in their journey. But frankly, all artists need a little love every now and then, no matter how experienced they may be. That entering into these conversations with a spirit of celebration, I have found to serve incredibly well. This might come up later. Like, I'm not necessarily the like only focus on the good sort of feedback kind of guy, but I think that making sure you are including the good, and also simply the acknowledgement, like, they wrote a play. That's awesome. Like, there was not a thing before, and now there is, and that is a thing that is worth celebrating. And so I think that spirit of celebration as a place to start is always well served. Yeah.
Yeah, Naysan, I love that you bring up the idea of the positive along with suggestions, questions. It's sort of that idea of that people may have heard of the feedback sandwich, right? Which is, there's that old thing of like, start with something good, give the questions or maybe the things that are a little tougher to wrestle with in the middle, and wrap it up with something good. But I think it's so important, Brandon, I love the way that you put in the idea of context. I think that, and where the person is in their life and where the play is in its life, remembering that that's a part of that sandwich too. And I love a mixed metaphor, so I'll continue saying, before you take a bite, you want to know what you're biting into. Yeah, I think that's so wise and smart. Yeah, Brendan.
I did want to flag, just on the feedback sandwich, I've actually found, especially for writers who are looking to engage in a rigorous process with someone else about their work, artists can often find a feedback sandwich being a little bit patronizing and distancing from a dramaturg that they're actually trying to deeply connect with. I think the impetus for a feedback sandwich is to try and create safety for your writer while you are giving feedback, because feedback can often be difficult, very difficult. But and one of the things that I've challenged myself to do, especially with script share, is to think about other ways of maintaining the safety of the space and the integrity of our intellectual space, and be very direct about what the note is. I think oftentimes when I've received notes as an artist, I've left I don't understand. I could feel like they were leading me to something. This is super unclear. And now I have to do all this unpacking to understand a note that was probably a great note. And so I think feedback sandwich for an artist who responds deeply to that structure could be really, really helpful, right? But especially if you see an artist not responding or pulling back from the openness and vulnerability that is actually necessary to have an honest conversation about your art, I think finding a new way to continue to keep the space safe and share directly what's happening may also help reinforce some of the authenticity that I think writers are really looking for when they're speaking with dramaturgs and catching notes.
Yeah, Naysan.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what I would add to that is that I think the value of starting one's thinking with something like the compliment sandwich is that it does help us. It is a lot easier to focus on, think about where there's work to do, where are the shortcomings, where are the flaws, what isn't working. It's a lot easier to find those things, recognize them, articulate them, talk about them. And I think the benefit of having this structure, the sandwich in mind, is that it reminds you, also say the good things. I would agree very much with you, Brandon, that I don't, because I've got a list and I go down the list rather than let me make sure I am alternating good and bad. I just go down the list, but it is a helpful check to say, okay, let me look at my list. Did the things that I loved, did I write those down? Am I taking the moment? And because it's often it is just a moment of hey, this was a thing that I loved. This was great. And maybe there's more to unpack, there's more to dive in. It's why was it great? What was so successful about it? But if nothing else, just making sure that you call out those moments of success as well. Even if it's not, I think that the explicit structure of the sandwich can sometimes be we're smart people. We oh yeah, I see what you're doing here. Is sometimes people appreciate it, sometimes they don't.
Yeah, Anne.
Yeah, I think another thing that I try and keep in mind when considering when and how to articulate the moments in a play that resonated with me, whether those are compliments or just sort of saying, I love this moment or what have you, I also try and think about what are the power dynamics in this space, and especially moments when I may be perceived as representing an institution or representing a kind of power in the new play field. I really lean a lot more into questions, presenting multiple options, adding in more compliments as possible. Whereas someone who maybe I've had a long relationship with, or we've had sort of similar career journeys, I'm going to be much more direct with them. And thinking about that relationship definitely comes into play when considering the ways in which I give feedback.
Yeah, I think that those power dynamics are so key. I mean, I think back to earlier in my career. This was when I was at Arena Stage, and it was I think maybe the first of our commissioned writers that I was having a conversation with about their piece after I started the job. And in my mind, it was like, yeah, like because I'd been a freelance dramaturg up to that point, and so in my mind, like, yeah, like I'm just a guy. These are my thoughts. And then after the fact, I was like, oh no, I'm no longer just a guy. Those are no longer just my thoughts. That even if that was not how I meant it, they were very much received with the weight and gravity of the institution. And so, yeah, that is very much a thing you have to be conscious of. And also, just to close a loop, I think, this is in preparing for this, I was thinking about when John Eisner stepped down from the Lark, he was sort of offering up his thoughts, and this ties into this, this idea of good and bad. And one of his the things he talked about in sort of his departing remarks that I found very interesting, even if I potentially disagree with it, was this idea that to focus on what is good rather than what is a problem, right? He says, if you take care of what is beautiful, it will thrive. If you ignore it, it usually fades. When you give a problem too much attention, it often grows bigger. In fact, some of what we initially experience as problems are not really problems at all. And I think there's a lot of value in there. But I think I fundamentally disagree with where he's sort of aiming with that of that's in the context for him of like, you don't need to worry about the problems because they're not problems, they're not flaws. Don't worry about fixing it. Just focus on what is good. And like, I think that if something isn't working, if there are shortcomings, I think there is value in saying that. But I think what is valuable in that is just the reminder to also don't forget about the good.
Well, and that's interesting because both the very right on comments about power dynamics, as well as this idea of you said the word John Eisner talked about problems. You said the word what's working, right? So there's this idea of the language of feedback, and I'd love to hear from you all how you. And I see Brandon, your hands up, so I'll and if you want to call back, cool. But then I'll let you carry the baton forward. How you approach talking to a writer in terms of language. Are you concerned about the language of judgment, as it were? Are you hyper cautious of trying to adjust your language from good, bad judgment call to working? I know, Anne, you mentioned the idea, and Brendan, I think you did too, of just asking questions. So I'd just love to hear a little bit about the language of feedback, as it were. And yeah, Brendan.
I mean, I think I carry into every project that I work on a very clear sort of remembrance that all the language that's developed around theater and how we described theater has also been developed during a time where its main purpose was to keep many other stories out, many other types of storytellers out, many ways that have been either erased, completely destroyed and like never, there are things that we can't recover about theater. But I think to understand that something that I navigate with agency is very, very often used to oppress underrepresented playwrights and playwrights of color. I think it does very often mean that I am working hard to translate my notes and to go, sometimes my notepads look like a legal pad where you're like sketching out both sides of the argument, especially if I'm giving what I think may be a difficult note or a really important note. I'm going to argue for why that note shouldn't be given at all and actually talk through this moment with the writer so they have all of the information about how to navigate what I'm specifically responding to. If you want to ignore it for the rest of your life, cool. If you want to take bits and pieces from it, great. But you actually have a mapping of what the entire thought was. And I think that really helps to disarm the language that's usually used as a tool for gatekeeping. I think I really want to work with playwrights in a way that nurtures what does exist. And I think, Naysan, the quote that you had shared earlier, I'd seen it before, and I think that's one of the things that excited me about that quote is the idea that to restore these stories back to the American theater canon, it's actually going to take a labor of love. It takes nurturing and development and acknowledging things that were tried and maybe not successful, but I saw you try and do this really, really complicated thing. And that excites me because it feels like a real opening of a door in theater that has been very, very closed up until now. So that sort of answers the question about language, but it's all in there.
Yeah. I think that's so smart what you say about just giving your thinking around the note is such a smart way to address power dynamics too, right? Because it is like you say, like, here's me, one person, and this is how I came to that. Take it or leave it. That's great. Other thoughts?
Yeah, I think that things like good, bad, works, doesn't work. There's shorthand, and Brandon, this is earlier when you were talking about building that rapport, building that relationship. That there are times, even if you've just met a writer, where you're based on that rapport, based on that relationship you've built in that short time, you can say, oh yeah, I can use that shorthand. And other times, like I need to avoid that shorthand because I think that the biggest thing that is sort of elided when we use those terms is that there's always a context, right? And that you have to make that explicit sometimes because it's not, if I am, to use a terrible metaphor, that if I'm cutting an onion versus mowing my lawn, like a kitchen knife, a chef's knife, and a lawnmower, they're both good tools, but they're not both good at that thing. They don't work the same in both of those scenarios. And so it's the same when we're talking about a moment in a script, that you have to know, what are you trying to do with the play? What are you trying to do with this scene? What are you trying to do with this line? What are you trying to do with this word? Because any judgment of good, bad, works, doesn't work is always in the context of what you're trying to achieve. And so they're shorthand. And if you know that you can use the shorthand and everything else that is left out is understood, great. Chances are you probably can't. That you need to use a few more words than that, just to make sure that the note is understood and received in line with both how you mean it and in the way that is serving the playwright's purpose. Yeah.
Anne, thoughts?
Yeah, I just, so much of what's already been said. I think, Brandon, I love that you used the word translate because that's one that I use a lot in thinking about my work as well. But the notes that I take as I read the script are not the notes that I make to prepare for the conversation itself. And to Naysan, what you're saying, the notes that I give to a theater company, if I'm like doing a reader report for them, that's a totally different style of language. And I think we've been talking about asking questions, and we've heard some of them already. What are you trying to do with this line? What are you trying to do with this moment? What are you trying to do with this scene, etc.? And then sort of from there, I tend to go, here is how I received it when I read it. And offer that. And it is simply an offering of a very particular person in a very particular moment in time when I encountered the script as it was. And then I think the conversation tends to go on from there about where those two things, what the playwright's trying to accomplish and how I received it, are aligned or not, and when it, and sort of where in that journey we want to be.
Yeah. I love the sort of two things in there I want to bring up. One, but I'd love to hear just a little more about and then maybe we'll sort of start to transition into sort of the flip side, what it means to be on the receiving end of feedback. But we've talked a little bit about the importance of understanding where a playwright might be, whether this is their first play, whether they are they've spent the last 4 years in an undergraduate program, or, and you bring up this point of the language you use, and I think we could probably extrapolate the type of feedback you give to a playwright versus if you're giving feedback to a company that you are reading for versus you're giving feedback to a friend. How does that, I just love to hear your thoughts on how that changes, what the difference is, and how do you know what lens to put on, what glasses to use, what language to use as you are, because feedback really starts, I think someone mentioned earlier, starts when you start reading the play, right? That's when your feedback session actually starts, not when you're in the room or on the Zoom with the person. So how do you know what you're going in as, or how to enter the play, I guess maybe is a way to say it.
So, I think that so much of what we do in theater, and certainly the way I approach dramaturgy, is, it's about framing and it's about your audience, right? And so this is the same for this act as well, just in the way the same conversation we have when we're talking about putting on a play. The concerns, the questions, thought processes are the same in this moment as well, right? So that recognizing the framing of who I am, what I am bringing to the table, but then also, that the audience of, is this the playwright who is in that incredible position of vulnerability of bringing me their play to read, or is this the faceless institution of a theater that is just the other end of an email address and an occasional check for reading scripts, or is this a institution that I know very well or that I'm a part of, right? Like that, you have to just think about the audience in the same way that we think about who is our audience when we're producing the play. It's the same here. And so that is much like when we're thinking about, okay, who is our audience for this moment? What are the pieces of information we need to be giving them in the program, on stage, etc.? It's the same here of what is the rapport, the history, what is this audience, what are they looking for, how much time are they putting into this process? All of those questions, because ultimately, it's still a moment of interaction with an audience. And so know your audience.
Great, well said. Anybody else thoughts on that?
I personally try and take a blank slate to the piece, no matter what, as I'm sitting down with it. I do double check my notes. My mother was a professor, so we had to learn how to double check everything literally on earth to make sure it's right. And I think that has helped a lot in what that looks like for an approach. I think the biggest thing to say on the topic is that so much of being a dramaturg, when it comes to like reading for institutions and then reading for individuals and giving feedback to friends, really has to do with very clearly understanding your relationships and the artistic styles of the people that you're actually trying to temper to. If If I'm reading for a specific institution, I'm thinking, okay, this is their branding, these are their colors, this is their mission, this is the type of theater that they actually produce, right? But if I'm providing feedback, I'm speaking to someone who I hope is a colleague and a peer, and I should understand the things that they pick up on theater. So I'm either going to provide, well, I want to best source my my playwright with the best opportunity to have success moving forward. And so the conversation is going to be framed at how this institution can specifically work and help with this play. The things that they do really, really well as a theater are going to bring out really fantastic colors with this specific work. And I think to a degree, each of us as dramaturgs have worked at different degrees of that. Reading for a full-out artistic department and you're planning an artistic.
Oh, I think Brandon, we lost one of your.
Oh no!
One of your ear pods. Mercury's in retrograde, y'all.
Mercury is super in retrograde. It's a thing. Can we hear me now?
Yes.
Great. I think sometimes if you're reading for an artistic institution and it's for their main stage season, the conversation is going to be much more rigorous and it's going to be a longer series of conversations, but especially when you're having a conversation with a friend or reading a one-off play, which I actually personally like the most, not having to filter an artistic institution's needs through how to develop usually a very, very young play, a very, very young playwright, and they are very scared. Not having to tip of that to an institution early on really, really, really helps them come up with their voice and figure out what story they want to tell.
Can we flip? I love that you talk about that idea of what the play needs and how, if you're talking to an institution, what that institution can bring it, or what you as the feedback giver can bring to the writer. Let's flip that. And how, as a writer, then, I mean, I guess really the question is, why seek feedback? And I think maybe something that I know certainly some folks I spoke with during Share, I think a new thought to them was when to seek feedback, right? So I'd love to just hear your thoughts about and guidance suggestions of what feedback can do for a writer and their play, and when to seek it out, and what it means to seek out that feedback depending on where you are, where your play is in its journey.
I want to loop real quick back to the earlier question, and then I will attempt to move the baton forward, because I want to lift up what Brandon was saying about starting an encounter with a script with a blank slate, which is something I try very much to do as well. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that more times than I can count, I have read a play in one context or for one purpose, and then I have either reread it in a totally different context or met the writer like 3 years later and in some other environment, and being able to remember the sort of distilled experience of my reactions to the script without those other layers actually feels pretty imperative as I try and build long-term relationships both with writers and with institutions. So there is a little bit more sort of layering after reading the script, but starting just sort of clean and fresh is how I try and approach reading. To the second question, when to seek out feedback, I think that's such a hard question. And I think it's a question I struggle to respond to. And I think a lot of writers struggle with it as well. But I feel like there are a couple sort of like moments of this is very new and I need it to be out of my head. Or this is sort of further along and I'm like stuck on this thing. Or this is even further along and I'm not sure what needs to happen, if anything, to sort of elevate it to a sort of, for lack of a better word, producibility or getting it out there to a life on the stage, which is what it was written for in the first place. There are probably some smaller benchmarks in between there. But for me, as someone who more frequently is in an officially titled like feedback giver position, it's super helpful for me to know where the playwright thinks they are, right? Like I can make a guess about where a play might be in its journey, but the more impactful thing is if a playwright can say, here is where I think I am with the play. Here is the work that I have done to date. Here is where I would like to go next. And I'm like, cool, here is where I am meeting you on the road of this play. And let's walk down a little bit of the road together.
Yeah, that's super tied into what Brandon said earlier about that, building that rapport, and really too about knowing your audience too. That's great. Brandon, I think I interrupted you. Go ahead.
No, I think the thing to remember about feedback for me as an artist is that there are many ways to get feedback. There are many types of feedback. There's like, hey, I have a scene. I don't know if it makes sense. I just need you to ask as many questions as you can possibly come up with. But I think the most important thing is a willingness to participate in the activity of thinking with someone together. I've given feedback to playwrights who we like scheduled for a month to get them on the books and make sure that we could do it. And then I found that we get to the actual feedback session, and the tenor of the conversation is actually that they weren't in a place for feedback. They needed confirmation and affirmation, which is actually a very different conversation. Yeah. Someone should have, or someone could go in and be like, these are the things that I'm deeply, deeply excited about. And the play was, for the most part, almost finished. I don't think that there was any note that I could give in this context that wouldn't be given in a production setting for the work. So relatively inconsequential. It's a bit of a wash, but I think it is a good example of not being ready to hear that your 93A is still about 7 points off. And I can identify where we are when I feel like I dropped out of the story or I got distracted by another thought. So I've missed what's actually happening on the page. And those conversations are really, really important conversations to have. And so I think more than anything, as an artist, I've benefited from asking for different types of feedback, for being very clear about the types of feedback that I find helpful in my artistic process. I don't necessarily know about I don't like feeling like I'm in production when I'm writing. I think that's maybe my thing when I'm receiving feedback. It feels weird to receive production notes while I am still crafting this theory for work. And I think a lot of people parse that pretty well nowadays.
Can I ask you, just because I imagine we've got a pretty, if we judge from the script share audience, probably the people watching this come from a wide range of backgrounds. Can you give an example maybe of what you mean by a note that to you would feel like a note that would be great if you're in rehearsal on the way to production versus something that's not useful when you're still in that generative stage?
Yeah, let's see. I'm gonna double back to, there was a two-hander play that we read that I enjoyed quite a lot. I think there were questions around, like, immediately my deepest dramaturg self wondered if theater was the exact medium for the story being told, but the story was still figuring itself out. And so when we're having a conversation about hey, this moment is super, super intimate, and I can see that you're crafting it through a lens where you expect the audience member to have their eye on these people's mouths, right? That's a note that's in the writing. Maybe we can't see this from the stage, but solving for that in a larger context where we're talking about, hey, this character may enter a little bit hastily, and I don't know if it establishes them as sure as they would like to be. I don't know that is a note while we're in the middle of early drafts for this character. I think what I feel like may be a bad note, because if the note is about how the character is established, then it should be about character development and maybe not about whether it's appropriate for theater. And exercises on character development help a lot with that. I don't know if I made any sense. I'm hoping I made sense.
Yeah.
But that's
Yeah,
probably
well,
the closest version of that.
And it all, just to my ear, on the most simple level, it feels like top line, watching out for notes that are director notes in a way, right? Like we're not at the director point yet. We're at a place where we're hopefully still in the pool, swimming around, figuring it out with folks. Naysan, anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the just in terms of this question of sort of when to receive feedback and what kind of feedback, I think part of it is going to depend on again, audience, context, etc. Who you're getting feedback from. So when it is a largely professional relationship, right? Like my playwright friends and any other playwright, like those are two very different kinds of relationships. And so my playwright friends, like they'll call me up and say like, hey, here's the I'm starting to think about my next play, and like here's the idea. Can I give you the pitch and talk that through? I'm like, yes, absolutely. That's a great, like those relationships are great for that early stage of just like, is this a thing? Whereas when it is a more formal, more professional relationship, I very much prefer, like I want to be looking at a whole thing. It might be a rough thing, and very well might be like, I think there's a missing scene somewhere, and maybe that's the question I have, is like, where should that missing scene go? But like, there's a draft, there's a thing, I can look at it. And I think that that's an important distinction, because what I think the biggest thing in terms of receiving feedback is having a clear sense for yourself as the artist of what is the thing I've made, or at least what do I think the thing I've made is, and what do I want the thing I've made to be. And so if you're still making it, then you're not able to hand it over to somebody else. And part of that is having the confidence to know, because I think that one of the biggest things when we talk about receiving feedback, I think one of the biggest things to keep in mind is you don't have to take every note that you're given. And if you don't have the confidence yet in what you've made and where you're trying to go with it, then like there's not the fortitude to say, okay, that's a note that's helpful to me, so let me take that in. That's a note I don't need. Whereas if you're still in that like, ooh, what is this? Then everything just hits and deforms it and bounces off. And so you have to be in a place of saying, okay, I'm at this place, here's where I am, let me go to the next place with it, and I need help getting up there.
Yeah, that's and maybe I think a great, I'm sorry, Anne, were you going to say something?
I was just going to offer a metaphor that I sometimes lean on in thinking about that is baking. And if a playwright can come to me and says, here is something I baked, then I'm like, is it a cake? Is it a pie? What kind of feedback am I trying to give? But if they say, I'm trying to make a pie, the crust is super soggy, I'm not sure if it should have cherries or blackberries, then I know sort of where to take my feedback. And I think I really want to encourage all playwrights to be able to say, here is a thing that I am trying to make when entering feedback conversations.
I love that metaphor, and I know Mary Berry loves that metaphor as well. And it's a great, I think it is a great segue into maybe the sort of last little section before we open up the Q&A, in an effort to maybe give writers watching some sort of tangible tips or steps to take away. We sort of emailed back and forth about maybe some ideas of advice, best practices, whatever you want to call it, to sort of keep in your mind as a writer when you are giving feedback. So I thought maybe we could just sort of talk through this list real quick. And the first one that I think might seem the most obvious, but I think can be the hardest, is to listen to the feedback. And what does that mean to you? What does it mean to listen, and why, if you've had an experience of that being a tough thing to do, why do you think it's tough to do that?
I can jump right in for that one. That I think the biggest thing to me, the importance of listening, is that I think we've all just in our normal lives have had those moments where you're like, oh, the person I'm talking to did not hear the thing I actually said. Right? That like those miscommunications that people can jump to either a confusion or offense. There's like, I think in this context, the reason why that's so much more important is that if you're receiving feedback from somebody who does this with care and with thought, then they have, as I think Brandon did a great job earlier of describing, like, we put a lot of thought into not only the content of the note, but also how we are giving it. And so part of it is a matter of mutual respect, but also just so it serves you best, like, listen to the thing we are actually saying rather than the thing you want to hear, the thing you're afraid of hearing, the thing you think you might be hearing. Listen to what is actually being said.
Other Anne or Brandon? Anything?
I think I found, did I do it again?
Nope.
I'm so sorry. I found in taking notes, listening often means revisiting and reflecting on the notes. I think I found myself getting caught up in like recording what the note is instead of hearing the note and sitting with what we're actually talking about, because it's actually a conversation. It's not like grading an essay or something. And I think a lot of the time we treat playwriting like it's like your essay is being evaluated for its efficacy. And like, to an extent, in a very, very, very detached way, you could describe playwriting that way, but I don't think it serves anyone to do so. And I think I've gotten better at listening. Maybe that's what this needs to be about how to practice listening. I think practicing listening, practicing, did I understand what was asked? Do I disagree with the information that was given? Do I agree? Am I confused by what was just said? Has actually helped me to be a much better active listener when it comes to taking notes, and a stronger dramaturg in giving notes. I can very clearly sense when we have started to miscommunicate, because your answer, that shouldn't have been the answer to what was just said. So we can go back and we can just sort out what it is. But definitely, I think asking myself those questions helps me to be a better listener to notes and better evaluate what is helpful and what's not.
That connects to sort of the numbers 2 and 3, and maybe we can sort of look at them together that I had. And number 2, and maybe this is specific to me, and maybe it's specific to learning styles, but I do find writing it down really helpful. I think you make a great point, Brandon, about knowing, making sure that you can listen and write, that you can still be involved. But I find writing it down helpful specifically so that I can do the number 3 thing, which is to ask questions, both of myself after the fact as I think back on it. But I'd also love to hear your thoughts about how a playwright can feel empowered in the moment as they're getting feedback, to make sure they're understanding, to make sure that they are getting the most out of the feedback possible. Because I feel like, again, we go back to that idea of power dynamic. Sometimes I think it can feel really intimidating when someone is, giving you notes on your baby. It's very vulnerable. It can be hard to feel empowered to have that two-way street. Do you have thoughts on how to do that? How to help writers be in that position?
I think in fact, I think part of it is incumbent on the feedback giver to make space for that, to pause and say, was that clear? Does that make sense? One thing that I've experienced a couple of times is a writer sort of responding with, well, if I did X, would that sort of answer the question of the play? And then that sparks a whole conversation, which really helps us make sure that what I offered and what was received are that we were understanding each other, that we were listening to each other. And I think another thing that is incumbent on the feedback giver is an appreciation of capacity and how much feedback a writer is in a place to receive at any given moment. It's a very vulnerable process. And so really trying hard not to just like overwhelm them. And so for the feedback receiver, I think make it like just sort of interrupting the flow if it comes to that and saying, can you clarify, or do you think that this script change would address this, and trying to sort of build that, some of that in, is what I would recommend.
Great.
Yeah, I would add that in terms of for the receiver, for the writer, I think one of the biggest, most important things that writers need to remember is that, like, it's your play. And not only is it your play, but like, I this is a dangerous thing to say in terms of like, I don't want to like foster any kind of crazy ego nonsense, but like the majority of, certainly, you know, Western American theater, we need playwrights like really badly. We need scripts. We need plays. Like without you, we don't have anything to do. And so it's your play. You are at the heart of this. Certainly, the power dynamics, like around, say, like a commission, that can. I have feelings about that, but I mean, like, that can affect things. But in general, it's your play. You have that power, and you shouldn't let yourself forget that. And so. And the other thing that goes hand in hand with that, I think, is that whoever you're talking to is, or at the very least should be, is on your team. That every note you are being given is in the spirit of helping your play be the best version of itself it possibly can be. Everybody you're talking to is on your team. And if there's somebody who's not in their team, like, there are toxic relationships. There are instances where an artistic director or a director, even a dramaturg, is giving you notes to make themselves feel smarter. Like, I guess that's a thing that exists. I think most dramaturgs are actually pretty generous, caring people. But like, yeah, that can happen, in which case you should run as far away from as you possibly can. But like, for the most part, overwhelmingly, notes are being given with the hope of them helping you. And so I don't think anybody who's giving you notes would want to walk away from the conversation and realize later, oh, they didn't understand the note. Like, that is, I will say that, like, one of the worst feelings I have had as a dramaturg was when I got the next draft and was like, oh, you didn't understand any of the notes that I had given you, actually. And so, like, asking a question, asking a clarifying question, saying, hey, this is what I'm hearing, like, all of that, like, that is never going to be received as an imposition. Like, yes, please, thank you for asking that. Yeah. I want to make sure you understand what I'm offering you.
I find it interesting how often the language that of therapy that I see sort of sometimes parodied, sometimes given in earnest in movies and TV, is some of the actual really useful language for talking about a play, right? The I'm receiving, the I'm feeling, the what I'm hearing. And actually, I want to, maybe this is a good place to tie in a question that we've got here from one of the attendees. How should a new playwright handle being asked for revisions during the rehearsal process? And yeah, Brendan, please, sorry, go ahead.
I'll throw up a thing that's maybe a tangential answer to this. I have found, both in witnessing playwrights do rewrites during rehearsal processes and witnessing playwrights do rewrites before rehearsal processes, that the playwrights who have the best experience with this are very, very clear about the amount of work they're able to do in a rehearsal process. I personally can do very, 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 very little as far as rewrites in a rehearsal process. And so part of that is just setting your team up for the expectation. If you want a rewrite on a song or a scene, then actually that should be planned, not rehearsal time for me. If you all are practicing and going through and doing scenes and figuring out what's happening, great, that's all wonderful. But I think being very clear with an institution about what your capacity is very easily sets you up to be able to mitigate that a little bit more cleanly. Now, if you haven't done that before you go in, I think it's a conversation about capacity. I don't think anyone wants to, or fingers crossed, let's hope, no one wants to drive their playwright insane getting ready for a production. And there's always a point at which we all must stop sort of creating our art and let it out into the world, even if it comes back to us and we make some more revisions later. But I think being overly communicative about what you can do, what you can't do, and where you work best really helps people to be able to show up and advocate for you. Because I promise, no matter what theater you're at, you probably have someone on that administration team who's like, let me try and make sure that they're getting everything that they possibly need to be successful. And if you can find that person, that advocate, you're good.
Great. Other thoughts, Naysan or Anne?
I mean, listening to Brandon's remarks, I'm actually reminded, Anne and I have been on a couple of conversations recently with writers and agents trying to put together some rolling world premieres, and like exactly what you were saying, Brandon, is such a huge part of those conversations, right? Of like making sure that everybody involved is aware and understanding of what the playwright is able to offer each step along that way. That it's like, yeah, like for these two productions, like I can be in the room every single day. But like that third production, like I'm just not, I'll be on set for the TV part, like whatever it might be. And it's like, that's huge. Just being clear, being upfront and being communicative. Beyond that, I think that it's, again, kind of what I was saying earlier, that remembering that revisions, rewrites, etc., are not coming from a place of like, your play is bad and you should feel bad, right? They're like, the reason they're producing your play is because they like it. And so anything that's coming out of that is just like, it's part of the process, right? That theater is not words on a page. It is bodies in space. And so the reason we do that process is to learn like, oh, actually, like this is a speech that doesn't really work, that doesn't do what we need it to do when it's said out loud by a human being. And so trust in that process and trust that your collaborators are there because they give a shit and they want your play to be good. Yeah.
And I would just add that the thing about theater, this weird and wonderful form, is that it's collaborative, right? That you're not away writing a novel, writing poems, that it is collaborative. And so clear communication, setting of expectations on both sides. If a writer comes in 3 weeks into rehearsal and is like, actually, I added 7 more characters, there was some miscommunication and some lack of clarity around what both parties could provide in that case. And I'm thinking as well of conversations I've had with playwrights where I'm like, okay, here is something you've identified that you would like to work on, or here's a note you've been given from the producer. Is that something we're fixing now in this workshop process? Or is that something you want to address after you leave, when you have like some alone writing time between the workshop and the production process, right? Like, when is the best time for a particular note to be implemented, and what is the time frame? Or if you're up against, and I'm thinking of an experience I had where the writer didn't want to stop revising, and opening night got closer and closer and closer. And so that was a conversation as well, that like, what are you trying to do with these rewrites? And is that something that our director, our actors, our designers can help us?
Yeah.
Are there other things other than text because opening night is just around the corner, that can help us address that need that you were feeling in the rewriting process.
Yeah.
So it's just about getting everyone talking and about what they can give and what they can receive at any moment in the process.
That's great, because really the common theme comes back to sort of what the core is ostensibly of theater, right? Which is collaboration, listening, communication. And I just want to reinforce for the writers out there, especially those artists at the earliest stages of their careers, where it can feel so miraculous to even have someone want to read your play, let alone put it on, that it can be easy to cede your power, to give that over, because you feel like you should just be grateful. And yes, we all should be grateful that we get to do what we do, right? Yes, and also we are artists who have thoughts and feelings and perspectives, and if we're not clear with each other about those, we can't all help each other do our best work for each other, which really sort of comes to number 5 on the list, which is be objective about feedback. And I might even, thinking about what Naysan said about, if you go into a room with an expectation, be willing to let your collaborators do their job. So I might say also be flexible, right? If you're going into rehearsal with a fixed idea in your mind of what the thing is, you're not letting your collaborators do their best work. So what does it mean when, I guess I'll say it this way and then maybe throw this out for thoughts. Part of being objective, I think, can sometimes be about looking for the note behind the note, right? Sometimes something hits you and you're like, nah, that's not right. Sometimes it's not right. Also, that nah is sometimes someone's touched a nerve or that you just don't understand. So I wonder if you talk a little bit about what role objectivity plays, what happens when something doesn't feel right, and maybe if one of you want to talk about the idea of the note behind the note for folks who haven't heard that idea.
So I think the thing I'm getting caught up on is objectivity.
Is that word or the idea?
The idea, I mean, is I don't, I am I tend to be fairly analytical. I like science. I like objectivity is a lovely idea. But I don't think it's a real thing that exists, particularly in this context. And I don't know that it's actually something that we should be striving for either. I think that instead it's about conscious, thoughtful subjectivity, right? That know what your biases are, know what your perspective is, own that, be open about that. Because in fact, I think that when we look at the characteristics of white supremacist society, like objectivity is one of the things on that list. This notion that there is a singular correct way oftentimes is, this gets at what Brandon was saying earlier about how this, the history of so much of our language in the theater is about keeping out certain kinds of people. And I think that the valorization of objectivity is part of that. So I think that, I certainly, when I'm giving feedback, I try to be very clear and very open about this is me, this is my experience of this is what I'm bringing to the table that is shaping my experience to the degree I'm able to do so consciously. Obviously there's an iceberg of things we don't realize when we're having these experiences. So yeah, objectivity is, I think that yes, instead of objectivity, it's about thoughtful, deliberate, conscious subjectivity instead. So that's where I'm getting.
Great. Yeah, that's great. Yeah. Others?
I mean, I definitely agree. I think my hesitation was to let the more seasoned vets tackle this one. I saw a collective like, objectivity. All right, cool. We're gonna dig into this. I found very often when playwrights are asked to take an objective stand on their work, it is usually some sort of dog whistle, either indicating that they are missing something that makes their work more palatable to a specific audience, which I don't find is the healthiest type of dramaturgy to practice, or it creates this process of like sociopathic disassociation in an art form that is fundamentally collective. I don't often see works that have been like dramaturg to death and have all of these objective facts about them. I don't find people really, really connect with them and really, really take home the messages of the work because it's so disconnected from what you actually connect with. So throwing out there that I don't know that objectivity is the right word. I think the way I translated it was like actually a willingness to be very, very deeply honest with yourself about where exactly you are with the work. And I think we can, when we're called to do that, when we're asked to be really, really honest with ourselves, we get to the right set of answers that don't create sort of weird sterilizing obstacles for playwrights. I think a lot of the time when we ask a playwright to be objective, the work or the moment or the scene gets sterilized in a way that's actually not serving the playwright or the story.
I would agree with everything that objectivity is not even perhaps not desirable, but I think sort of not necessarily possible in this work that we are asked to bring our whole selves to. And I'm thinking in this conversation of a playwright I encountered many years ago whose rule of thumb was, I won't take a note, I won't act on a note unless I've received it 3 times. And it's long enough ago that I don't remember if it was three separate people or 3 different experiences of getting feedback on the play, or if it was the same person could say it 3 times over the course of a day and maybe they would act on it. But I think that's such a lesson about like clarity that this writer had around the distance between receiving the feedback and acting on it. And I think another thing that I would offer to playwrights who are receiving feedback sort of outside of a production process, perhaps, like script share, for example, is you don't have to act on it right away. Sometimes you'll get 3 drafts later and then be like, oh, I remember that getting asked that question. And now I see how I can answer it in a way that feels authentic to the story that I'm trying to write. So I think sometimes as a receiver of feedback, it's about creating a little bit of space, whether that's time, whether that's repetition, to reach some level, not of objectivity, but being able to be honest with yourself, as has been said, about how to receive that.
Yeah, I love that. That's really beautiful, guys. Thanks for that check, because I think those 3, that sort of triad of ideas of thoughtful subjectivity, of deep honesty, and of space and distance are all so beautiful and honestly more actionable. We've got 2 questions, so we might run a little over 5:15, but I think these are both really lovely, important questions that I'd love to get to. So I hope you'll all forgive me. But one of our attendees says, a challenge for Black and Brown playwrights is the high probability that their work will be produced by white-led theaters. How do you handle script feedback when there's a cultural and racial disconnect? It's a great question.
Yeah, it's hard. And I think that the first thing I would say is that it's about the the situation in the first place, and that kind of like one of the themes I think throughout this conversation has been just the importance of looking ahead down the road and having open conversation and communication and honesty. And so if you are a writer of color and your work is rooted in that experience and in your community, and you are taking it to a predominantly white theater, I think it's about making sure that there's somebody else in the room who knows where you're coming from and that can back you up and that can be an advocate. And if you can't have that, then at least like knowing that the well-intentioned white folks in the room like genuinely are like that they are willing to listen and be open and hear what you've got to say, and recognize that there is an expertise and an experience coming from you as the artist, as the writer, that they don't have access to, because when they don't come into the experience with that perspective, then it is a recipe for trauma and frustration all around, and no advice we have to offer is going to change that. Because I think that when that's the situation you're in, where it is a predominantly white institution, and there's not some skin folk with you who have your back and can help you out, then it's about being able to, again, like that fortitude that I was mentioning earlier, of being able to like, no, this is the thing that matters. This is the experience. This is the truth of this. And that can be a hard thing to have to say, particularly when there is that power imbalance, as there is always going to be for a writer of color in a predominantly white institution.
Any other thoughts?
Can I throw out, there is actually not a shortage of Black and brown dramaturgs out here. We have done a lot of work to compile a number of lists as resources. If your concern is not having an advocate of color who can do the translating for you, that can like sit in the rooms and rigorously hold their own with your artistic team to be able to advocate for you, ask for a dramaturg. In the world of a production, we may not actually be that expensive. I know most, which is not to say we don't pay people of color, but most people of color are happy to hop on board as a labor of love. I don't want to commit anyone else's time, but it's about genuinely trying to provide support where support is. There may be 200 names on that list of dramaturgs of color. And so I would use your resources as much as possible. It's not going to mitigate the problem of predominantly white or it's not going to completely solve the problem of predominantly white institutions, but it may help mitigate some of the confusion and translating and help you have a much better experience for producing your play.
And oh, sorry, go ahead, Anne.
I was just gonna tag on all of this and go back to the sort of earlier conversation about clarity of expectation setting going in. Just last week, the Dramatists Guild released language for inclusion writers. So beginning those conversations about who you want in the room with you and how harm is going to be addressed in the event that it arises and how harm can be prevented. Having those conversations in advance is really, I think, really important. And now, as Brandon is saying, there are tools. There's amazing lists of dramaturgs. There's the Dramatists Guild inclusion writer, and you don't have to be alone in your people or in your tools in entering those spaces.
And Ying just put in the chat, for anyone who's interested, a link to an article about that Drama Guild inclusion writer, which is really, really useful. So we've got two questions. One, I'm gonna take the liberty to answer, and then I'm gonna throw the last one out to the group. One attendee, an actor zooming in with us, asked, what do you do about actor questions about the play? For example, as an actor, I never ask the writer anything, but as a writer, I would love to have the discussion. I know people are hesitant. So I will just throw out that I think this again goes back to that idea of sort of expectation setting going in. And I think it's about looping in, making sure the director and the playwright are on the same page, as much as we try to create non-hierarchical structures that can sort of, come up in the room. People want one person to go to. So make sure that you are on the same page with your collaborators. I know particularly in workshops, a lot of writers love getting to workshop with actors, because actors are doing that thing, which is looking at one character deeply and kind of almost by default seeing things that the playwright has probably missed as they're thinking about the big picture. So I personally find real value in that. But again, it depends on the writer, it depends on the process, it depends on where you are in the process. So I would say sort of have those conversations going in before you get to the point where you want to ask that question. So thank you for that. The last question is a really lovely one to end on, I think on. And Regina directs this to playwrights, and I know that some of us on this call are writers, some identify not as writers, but I think as artists, we can all answer this question. She says, I wonder how you all nourish your beings. It seems to me that you operate as guiders of sacred letter tapestries. You're nourishers, and nourishers have to be nourished in order to pour out their wisdom and remain healthy. I'm wondering about your self-care practices. So maybe a lovely note to leave on is if you wouldn't each mind sharing something you do as an artist to make sure that you remain full enough to then turn around and pour back out when the time comes. And I'll just sort of call round robin if you don't mind. Brandon, do you mind starting?
Sure. The biggest part of all of my practice, because theater is truly my vocation. Trained as a musician and have dramaturgy experience, and I spend so much of my time trying to make sure that I am appropriately rested, which sometimes means that like 2 o'clock I need to stop and take a nap. I think I have latitude in a way that I haven't had before, so I've been able to be more deliberate about what rest looks like, whether rest is like sleeping or going for a walk or spending time with friends or spending time with my partner. These, like, for me, those are the things that help keep me centered, help keep me grounded. I follow the Nap Ministry on Instagram, and it's done wonders for how I think about my creativity and what I expect of my creativity when I'm completely wiped. I don't know why, like personally, I would expect to be thoroughly exhausted and to be at my creative peak at the same time. It literally makes no sense. But that regular reminder of like, hey, in order to be creative, in order to imagine the new world that we're all trying to create together, you're gonna have to sleep. It's just a real thing. It's helped my practice. It's my dramaturgy has gotten better. All of my relationships have gotten better. By all means, please rest.
Great,
That's
beautiful, lovely. Anne.
It's funny, when the question was asked, I was also thinking about rest as well. And another really important piece for me is just being in my body. So I'm a runner, and just getting a couple miles in. And sometimes it's at the start of my day if I know it's going to be a long day, but sometimes taking a break in the middle of the day, just to get away from my desk, to get away from words in front of my face. I love words, but I need to take a break to return to them more full and more ready to embrace them. And I find so much of my best thinking happens when I'm running. So that it's just like everything just shakes into place. That's a big part of my practice.
Great, thank you. Naysan.
First, I would say, as somebody who every medical professional in my life tells me I don't get enough sleep. Thank you, Brandon. I was not familiar with the Nap Ministry. Thank you, Gander. I mean, I have hobbies. You know, I read comics. I like craft beer. But I think that the biggest in terms of self-care. I think for me, it's really about something that is really about the heart of what theater is community and connecting with other people, right? I mean, whether that's my family, whether that's my friends, but also, I mean, I actually find when I am talking to a playwright, when it's a good conversation, a good relationship, a piece that I'm excited about, like I frequently leave those conversations energized. Like I actually am filled up by those. You know, so the last year and a half has been rough. But you know, as we reemerge, I mean, being in you know, one of the reasons I'm a dramaturg and not something else is like I don't actually like being in rehearsal all day every day, but like being in rehearsal for the first week of a process like is wonderful. Being, you know, at Roundhouse, we're slowly returning to the office on a occasional basis, and like, you know, sitting around our conference table with the rest of the artistic department is it's marvelous. And it's that is what enables me to do my work, is that reminder of why we are doing the work and who we are doing the work for and who we're doing the work with. And so, yeah, that those shared experiences that are at the heart of theater, like that is actually the thing that fills me up. Yeah, community.
Great. I mean, yeah, for myself, I have to say script share was actually really nourishing for me during this last year, to be able to have those really lovely, honest, personal, human conversations, even across a Zoom chat about a play, about a world that nobody else has ever thought of, was really nourishing. I will say the thing that I also really have taken out of this last year and continue to try and work on as an idea of self-care is actually saying no and when to say no. You know, I had Brandon, you mentioned the idea that there are a lot of people who are willing to come into a room and sort of lend their time for the love of it. And I think that's beautiful, and I want to honor that. I want to also recognize that that gets taken advantage of. So I want to, you know, one of the things that I'm really working on is knowing when to say no. Sometimes it's worth it to go into a room for $0 because I know that I'm going to get something, I'm going to get fed in another way. I'm working on getting out of that scarcity mindset and going, you know what, actually, I wish you the best of luck. This is not the best fit right now. Here are a couple of other people you might try. Can't wait to see your project. Can't wait to see who you get for the whatever job, whatever it is. So that's something I'm working on. And I will say that this has been really nourishing for me as well. I want to thank all of you, Brandon, Naysan, and thank you to the Playwrights Realm, to Ying and Francisco for having us, and to all of you who listened in. Be well, be brave, make beautiful worlds, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.